Hi, everyone, and welcome to Breaking the Spell. Here, we are doing this session at nighttime in Singapore with my co-host Santosh. I'm Douglas, and we have a really special guest tonight. It's morning for him in America, and that's Professor David Livingstone Smith. David, thanks so much for coming on.
Oh, thank you. I don't know how special I am, but I'm honored to be invited.
No, the pleasure and the honor is ours, David. So we've invited David tonight, Professor David tonight, to talk about a really, it may seem like a very grim and dark subject, which is about dehumanization. But I'm really interested in his work into what it has to tell us about human nature, about moral psychology, and at the same time, Professor David is also someone who is a philosopher, so I'd like to get a little bit into that as well. It's a great honor to have you on. So what I'm going to do is just formally introduce your credentials. Then I have a kind of like my own personal introduction to why I invited you on. So let me just go with that first. So for everyone out there who don't know who's Professor David Livingstone, he's a professor of philosophy at the University of New England in Maine. He has published or edited 10 books, including his 2011 Less Than Human, Why We Demean, Enslave and Exterminate Others, which won the 2012 Anisfield-Wolf Award for contributions to the understanding of racism and appreciation of diversity. In recent years, he's been very efficient with publishing more books, which includes On Inhumanity, Dehumanization and How to Resist It, that's in 2020. And his most recent book, which I have here, Making Monsters, The Uncanny Power of Dehumanization, and that's 2021. David is a highly regarded scholar. He's been described as a philosopher seeking not just to interpret the world, but to change it. His book On Inhumanity was praised by Harvard University Professor Cornel West as philosophically sophisticated, prophetically courageous treatment of dehumanization, especially in regards to race. And University of Pennsylvania law professor Dorothy Roberts also says that his book provides a chilling warning of repeating the past and a hopeful call to create a more humane future. He's been all around. You can find several talks that he's provided on television, international media. He was even a guest at a 2012 G20 summit where he spoke on dehumanization and mass violence. So, like I said, repeating it again, it would be a great honor and privilege to have him on our channel. So I just want to talk a little bit now from my perspective, why I have David on. I studied psychoanalysis as an undergraduate, and David has that kind of background. So I'm very interested to tease out that theoretical underpinnings from psychoanalysis, what he has to say about human nature and psychology. And I think even though we're going to talk about dehumanization, but if we don't talk about the theoretical underpinnings, it would miss like the bigger picture. I've read 3 books to prepare. So Making Monsters, On Inhumanity, Why We Lie. And my recommendation actually for viewers is that out there, if you're unfamiliar with David's work, start with On Inhumanity because it's kind of an introduction, right, to the concept of dehumanization. And although it's older, but I did really like Why We Lie because I think it's pretty pertinent to the evolutionary science of deception. And I think it's very important points to make about the unconscious mind, which I hope we can get into. And then, of course, this book is kind of like the graduate version of dehumanization. And look, it's really dense and technical, but I still enjoyed reading it. So much thoughts about it. I definitely can't give it full exposition tonight, but I'll try my best. And before we start, right, don't worry, we're going to get there. I just want to give a content warning because, look, this is really like a deeply horrific and incredibly real subject. It deals with major atrocities in human history. So we are going to talk about the Holocaust, the Rwanda genocide, the Black lynchings in America. And I do intend to share some graphic details because I think it's a terrible disservice to talk about such topics and to discuss them in such an abstract manner or academic manner and not really like get into the gist of, get into the meat and gritty of it. And it was only through reading the book, right, like reading the very graphic account of what happened, in this events, in these atrocities, that it really, really touched me. And I think, there's no way that you can discuss these topics without, you can talk it in a general sense. You really do have to get into the meat and bones of it. Yeah. So anyway, How we actually start, right, David, is that I usually ask our guests a standard opening question. So, so it's now your turn to talk. So what I want to ask you first is, when was the first time you realized something was not right with the world? It may not have to do with dehumanization, but take us through what comes to your mind.
Oh, well, the first thing that comes to my mind is actually something I discussed in the beginning of On Inhumanity, which was growing up in the deep south of the United States in the 1950s and 60s. So that was during the Jim Crow era. It was the era of segregation. Black people and white people did not mix. Schools were segregated. Movie theaters were segregated. And in the town that I lived in, African Americans lived in dire poverty. And you just can't help seeing that as a child if you've not been enculturated into Southern culture, like I wasn't. My family moved down from New York City. So I wasn't part of that world. And if you're not part of that world, you just cannot help but recognize there's something terribly wrong here. And of course, the racism was not, it wasn't hidden, it wasn't dog whistles. It was explicit and it was overt. In addition to that, I grew up in an extended family with my mother's parents, both of whom were children. Well, they were actually refugees. They were refugees from Romania and Belarus. Their families moved to the United States long before the Holocaust. But there was a palpable sense of the world is a dangerous place. People are dangerous to one another. Oppression and injustice are rampant in human societies. So it was that mix, I think, that ultimately set me up for exploring the topics that I write about in my books.
Yeah, reading your work, there's always a lot that you talk about regarding your family members, including your grandmother. And I do want to, use that as great examples to talk about in terms of dehumanization. Before we move on, right, I think it's also good for our viewers to know, just to give us kind of a concise definition of dehumanization so that we can kind of set the stage right.
Yeah, that's a really important question to ask early on, because the word dehumanization means a lot of different things. It's really an extraordinarily broad range of meanings. So the word was introduced into English in the early 19th century, and it had no real definite meaning then. And then over time, it's been used to, well, let me give you a few examples, and then I'll explain what I mean by dehumanization and why it's very important to be explicit. So some people think of dehumanization simply as cruel and degrading treatment. So on that view, dehumanization is something that you do to others when you abuse them, when you oppress them, when you torture them, when you kill them. Other people think of dehumanization as something that's rhetorical. It's using a certain kind of speech against others, calling them animals or, vermin or monsters or whatever. So you can see right away, these are two quite different things, right? The treatment of this bad treatment, this horrible treatment, does not necessarily involve that kind of speech. And that kind of speech doesn't necessarily involve that kind of treatment either. Some people think of dehumanization as treating others or seeing others as inanimate objects, as things simply to be used. And there are many other variations. So even if you confine your attention to the scholarly literature, there are 8 or 10 logically distinct meanings of dehumanization. In psychology, there's yet another one in the psychological literature, thinking of others as not having minds. So that's just in the scholarly literature. Now, if you look at vernacular uses of dehumanization, it's even broader. So, you can Google the word and you'll get millions of hits. And if you dig into those, you will see that the meanings are all over the map. Now, it's not the case that some of these are correct and some of these are incorrect. Dehumanization just has a lot of meanings. And if we take dehumanization of one sort or another seriously, it's very important to distinguish between these things. Because if I'm talking to you, say, and we're talking about dehumanization, and you mean something entirely different by the word than I do, then we're not going to get anywhere. And if we're engaged in, say, a scholarly exchange or some sort of research project into dehumanization, we're not going to get anywhere. So we need to be explicit. My view, and I have reasons for choosing this view, is that dehumanization is the attitude. Let's pause with that for a moment. The attitude. So it's something psychological. It's something that happens in your head. The attitude of thinking of others as less than human creatures. Now, all of those things need to be unpacked. So I've covered attitude. It's kind of a belief, a kind of way of conceiving of others. Less than human. Well, what does that mean? It means less. Let me start that sentence again. I mean less than human in what philosophers would call a specifically moral sense. That is, of less intrinsic value than human beings. So the idea of intrinsic value is some things have value because of what they can get for us. That's not intrinsic value, that's instrumental value. Something with intrinsic value is valuable just because it is what it is, right? So less than human then is the idea that these dehumanized individuals have less intrinsic value. Their lives don't matter or don't matter as much than the lives of human beings. And finally, the word creatures. I didn't say animals, I said creatures, because when people are dehumanized, in fact, in what I consider to be the most dangerous and toxic forms of dehumanization, the dehumanized population are not simply seen as rats or lice or roaches or bloodthirsty predators or whatever. They're seen as monstrous, demonic sorts of beings. So I want the word creatures because it has a much broader scope than animals. So let me just, now I've been talking about it, let me pull it together again. So in my view, when we dehumanize others, we conceive of them as less than human creatures.
Yeah, I think that's a great, concise definition. And definitely what I want to do is go through the two important components that's required for that, right? Which is psychological essentialism and a hierarchical way of thinking, right? So I want to go through that later. But before we get into the theoretical aspects of it, let's put it that way, I do want to then read, like I promised in the introduction, some kind of graphic account, because I think if anyone's kept up to listening to us right now, I want to present them a really real picture, vivid picture of what dehumanization looks like. And so in your book, right, you tend to start with the story of Henry Smith, a 27-year-old mentally disabled Black farm worker who was tortured and burned to death in 1893 due to accusations that he may have raped and murdered a young white child. So I'm just going to quote from the book, so just give me about 2 minutes. And like I said, content warning here, it's going to get really, really vivid. So I'm paraphrasing. It was reported that the city was wild with joy over the apprehension of the brute, and citizens were determined that the punishment of the fiend should fit the crime. School, businesses, and saloons were closed in favor of the festivities, and everything was done in a business-like manner. Smith was paraded around the city on a carnival float, where he was displayed as a king on a throne, holding a makeshift scepter. His clothes were then torn off piecemeal and scattered in the crowd, people catching the shreds and putting them away as mementos. The victim's family members gathered around Smith as he lay fastened to the torture platform and thrust hot irons into his quivering flesh. The man was dying by slow torture in the midst of smoke from his own burning flesh. Every groan from the fiend was cheered by the thickly packed crowd of 10,000 persons. After burning the feet and legs, the hot irons were rolled up and down Smith's stomach, back, and arms. Then his eyes were burned out and irons were thrust down his throat. The crowd then doused him with kerosene and burned him alive. When the burning was over and only charred remains of a corpse remained, trophy hunters picked through the ashes for pieces of bone, buttons, teeth, or pieces of charcoal to take home with them as souvenirs. So David, just a few comments. So when I read that, right, I mean, what scared me more actually wasn't the perpetrators, it was the viewers, it was the passive bystanders who totally accepted that everything that was happening was normal and was justified. And I know you pointed out that if anyone tried to Google this particular burning event on the internet right now, they'll find an image with the word justice as a banner, right? What I want to do with this account, David, is then now to turn the question to you. So as you mentioned in your introduction, you lived through the tail end of the Jim Crow era, and that's somewhere 1950s to 1960s, right? Now, I assume, of course, things weren't as horrific back then as compared to what I just read. But as you said, there were still patterns, tangible patterns of racial discrimination and dehumanization. So what I want to ask you is to get deeper into your personal history. Can you describe what life was like back then, living in that deep South, right? How did people behave? How did people even think about reading this kind of account? Did they think that they were more enlightened? Did they think things have improved? And, do they feel like they're no longer monsters anymore?
The
or
people
dehumanizers, sorry.
Well, the people that I associated with didn't really talk about lynching very much. I'm sure it was common knowledge, particularly amongst the older people. I'm sure that let's take two groups of people. African American people were still living in terror. I'm sure of that. And the older white people, not people like my family that moved down from the north, but people whose families were Southern families, for the most part, I'm sure they would be perfectly fine if these things are going on. In fact, when I was 11 years old, I was getting a haircut. And this was a real small town that I lived in. And the culture was very rough. It was very raw. It's kind of, there was a distinctive cultural atmosphere that's very hard to explain unless you have experience with the rural South. So I'm sitting in the barber shop, and the barber is a real, Southerner of that era. And he's cutting a man's hair, and I'm waiting, and the radio is on. And what's being broadcast on the radio is a story about something that was taking place in the state of Alabama. That was the march dramatized in the movie Selma, where there was basically, it wasn't a massacre, but it was extraordinary violence at the hands of the police as protesters were trying to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And so this is going on. It's describing it as it's happening. And my barber is saying to his customer something like this. These are not the exact words, but it's pretty close. It's a shame the Ku Klux Klan isn't more active these days, right? And that is just full of implications, right? So this kind of stuff was always there, just below the surface, and would occasionally erupt in behavior, in words, and so on.
Actually, those words, as haunting and chilling that they are, said back then, it's it's unfortunately, I hate to say it, I think it's still being spoken about nowadays.
Yeah.
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 Santosh, do you want to ask something first before I go on?
No, I think there are just two things that came to my mind. The first thing is the work that I do as a minority in a minority group in Singapore. So it's called Somatic Abolitionism. So that's the first part of what I wanted to just share, Somatic Abolitionism. And the second thing I wanted to talk about is this tension between the bystander effect and offering allyship. And it's a tension. And we don't know where to place our bets depending on the circumstances and the situations we are placed in as human beings when we see and when we witness accounts of tortures just right in front of our eyes. So I think the first thing about somatic abolitionism is this idea that black bodies are less free and loose than white bodies. It is, even today in the African American people in the US, when they describe how they feel in their bodies, they feel a lot less looser and freer. So they are a lot more inhibited, and they are in states of high levels of stress or hypervigilance than white people. And the kind of healing work that's going on in the US, it's somatic abolitionism, which is to help heal that somatically. Because you can't just use the cognitive mind to heal the systemic and structural oppression that has been passed down, the trauma that has been passed down from generation to generation. It needs to go to the level of the body. And this is one area of work that I'm personally fascinated with, because as a minority in Singapore, where I look at bridging differences across race, religion, gender, and class, this is a very important piece of work that I do. So that's the first reaction, right? Like, it can't just be an intellectual discourse-based exercise. It needs to go to the somatics, and there needs to be significant amount of trauma healing that has happened and intergenerationally. So that's the first point. I think the second point that I talked about, I have been a bystander to an act of cruelty and dehumanization right in front of me, and many people have, as members of the public, right? And things are going in our mind. Do we intervene, or do we just become a bystander and just avoid it? So I think those are calculations we all have as human beings. If we are a bystander, it's a lot about self-preservation, because if you are going to speak out against a majority view of how things are, then your existence or your life might be compromised. But if you don't, and if you go to the other side, which is, if you offer allyship, then if you're a bystander, then you would feel guilty, or you'll feel there's a prick in your conscience. But if you offer allyship, then there's the fear of self-preservation. So that's the tension we all face as human beings. And I think something that's worth talking about later on is, how do we manage these tensions as human beings, as we live in a society where we notice accounts of discrimination? And you mentioned acts of violence which are physical in nature or verbal, but I think the state of society and the affairs that I have experienced are kind of subtler forms of violence, which are like microaggressions or subtle forms of racism, casual racism. So the frown in the eyes, the disapproving look, those are like signs and signals that we give to other people to kind of dehumanize them.
David, can you just give a kind of response to what you just heard?
Well, of course, there's so much to comment on. One, I could go off in many different directions. If you are, let me tell you a story. I mentioned my grandparents, my mother's parents. And I usually speak of my grandmother when I speak of them. This time, my grandfather. So he and his 12 siblings and his parents came to the United States in 1906. He was just a baby. And they were escaping anti-Semitic violence in Belarus. You know, there were pogroms, there were rapes, there were slaughters. In fact, the family story says that my grandfather was born in a haystack when the Jews were being attacked in the village where they lived. He was hidden, or rather his mother was hidden in the haystack by a Christian family, and she gave birth under the hay. I don't know if that's true. I imagine it's been embellished very considerably, but it conveys something about a kind of relationship with the world that one has if one comes from a persecuted minority, right? And that's not a superficial thing, it's a very deep thing. It's not entirely negative, right? It's not entirely negative because those sorts of experiences and those sorts of anxieties, if used well, can attune one to features of the human experience that others who have perhaps led more secure lives or whose parents and grandparents have led more secure lives would be blind to. So, you know, I'm a big fan of the idea, and this alludes somewhat to my psychoanalytic background, that there are certain kinds of damage that don't go away. There's certain kinds of wounds that don't heal. So the trick is to use that damage well, use that damage, say in this sort of area, for instance, in the service of humanity, in the service of trying to make the world a better place. So there's all that, and there's also the bystander thing. So right away, here's a point which is very central for me. I like to change the language. So we have a language we use, like the term allyship and microaggressions. I think those terms have become kind of stale. And just as I write graphically about things in my books, I want to speak graphically and directly. So for instance, I usually don't use the term Jim Crow. When I'm talking about those things, I usually talk about horrendous anti-Black terrorism. So instead of allyship, what I like to talk about is just standing up for justice, standing up for justice and humanity. I think it's a richer way of talking. And I think it targets what we're after more effectively than ally. Is kind of a quasi-military term, isn't it? Where if we're allies, and no. So with respect to the bystander thing, of course, we would all like to think that we would stand up for justice, even at risk to ourselves. You know, when I talk about Nazi Germany, people are inclined to say, no, I wouldn't have supported the regime. Right, that's easy. That's really easy to say. You know, our tendency to go along with these things, to endorse them, even enthusiastically, it's very rarely, if ever, a result of some kind of rational calculation. The thing is, when you're caught up in these ideologies, you believe them, right? There are plenty of ordinary Germans who believed that they were ridding the world of evil. in prosecuting the Holocaust. In fact, that's typical of genocides. People who commit genocides don't sit there and say, ha ha, I'm doing bad. No, they see themselves as saving the world. In fact, they see it as a moral obligation. So in the first place, once you have made the first step, and propagandists are very, very good at getting us to make the first step, then it's very difficult not to slip into some really horrible and dangerous ways of thinking and acting. Just because, you know, we have psychological vulnerabilities. We can be manipulated. We can be frightened into certain kinds of attitudes. We can be seduced into certain kinds of attitudes. So that's one bit of that. Most of us cannot really properly picture what it would have been like to be a German in 1935 or a Rwandan Hutu in 1994 or whatever. We can't. We kind of transport ourselves as we understand ourselves now in the worlds that, you know, the environments that we're in. And imagine all that would be the same, but it would not be the same. It would not be the same at all. Quite apart from that, then there is the issue of, well, what if you don't endorse what's being done and you're trying to, you're morally torn, right? You feel that you should intervene, but you're aware that there's a price to pay. And the price is not necessarily being an object of physical violence, right? You might end up alienating yourself from your friends, your family, your culture, and so on. Well, that's a hard one. And it's easy to overestimate how courageous and how moral one might be in those circumstances. I think recognizing that makes it more likely that one would do the morally right thing. In other words, I think, and this pertains to many of the things that I write about and talking about, when we recognize how difficult it is, right, to resist, that makes us more able to resist.
Wow, there's so much that you said there that I will definitely get into later. Things to do with complicity, things to do with bystander. In fact, I want to read you a quote that I clipped from your book because I think you kind of elucidated this very brilliantly. It reads, "It's easy to be moral heroes in our fantasies. Dehumanization isn't a choice. Imagining it's something that's within our conscious control is to greatly underestimate its danger. The more confident you are of your ability to resist dehumanization, the more vulnerable you are likely to be to its uncanny power." I have to say the last statement, I don't know. I'm trying to figure that out because I like to think that through the mere fact that I'm reading about you and I'm trying to understand your work, I am doing my best to resist dehumanization. I mean, I don't know whether that's the right way of putting it, but I do want to ask you this, David, because actually I should have asked this earlier, and it's actually it's very appropriate to bring this in now because we've been talking about bystander effect and about how difficult it is and how to resist dehumanization. It's all in the mind. So anyone is watching this video right now, very likely this person is in a position of comfort and privilege, probably living in some place with a good internet access and very safe from the atrocities that we've described. And they're going to feel like, hey, why does this topic even concern me, right? Why do I need to care about dehumanization? And they may not even have anyone around them that may be suffering from it. So I want to ask you to provide a kind of statement of caution, right? Why citizens of, so to speak, maybe wealthy, affluent democratic societies should be concerned. So it can be someone in America, someone in Singapore, someone in Japan, whatever, right? And actually, one point of note I'd like you to talk about, because I've noticed you brought up a few times, is actually your fears that catastrophic climate change is likely to be a potential driver for dehumanization.
Yeah, so why should people in positions of security and privilege, relatively so, be concerned about dehumanization? Well, there are several reasons for that. One is that it's the right thing. It's the right thing. We should be concerned about the dangers posed to others. And we should extend our imagination to encompass that. So often, I see with my students, we're covering some topic or other, and they'll say, well, it doesn't really pertain to me. But that's a real limitation of imagination, right? We need to extend ourselves. If we care about standing up for humanity, if we care about healing the world, however unsuccessful that is doomed to be, we need to give it our best shot, I think. So that's one reason. Another reason is just in virtue of being part of the world economic system, we support terrible things. So it's not like we have our hands clean. I got up and made a cup of coffee this morning. For all I know, that coffee was harvested by child slave laborers in the Ivory Coast, right? We are all part of exploitative and harmful systems. As my wife, who's also a philosopher, likes to put it, as soon as I wake up, I start sinning. We're part of that, right? So it's not like, we've got our hands clean. We all have dirty hands. Third, there's simply a matter of self-interest. If just a little glance at history shows us how things can change, right? And any of us could end up victims of dehumanization as history goes through its cycles and transformations. I don't think that's a real good motive for being concerned about dehumanization, but it is an actuality. There are people in the world suffering, and there are hotspots of dehumanization and atrocity. I think a lot of people, when they find out about these things, it's much harder for them not to be at all concerned. So, of course, one way that we protect ourselves and our cultures protect us from concerns is enclosing us in these little bubbles where information is filtered. Here's a funny thing about someone who does what I do, writes on dehumanization. There'll be long stretches of time where no one seems very interested. My book's sales drop. I don't get contacted by journalists and so on. And then suddenly something happens. Donald Trump gets elected, or there's a warning of genocide, as there is now in India. And then suddenly people get interested again. So it's like, as soon as people can relax, oh, this is just, this isn't relevant to me. And then when there's a reminder, bam, it's back. Now, I think that's an extraordinarily short-sighted attitude. If I'm correct about dehumanization, it has been an incredibly significant, incredibly dangerous phenomenon that has been with us God knows how long, at least thousands of years. And there is always a potential for this erupting. Now, you asked about my fears. I mean, that's it very, very generally. We get an economic crisis or something else that makes people feel vulnerable. I think vulnerability is a key here. and they are, in virtue of that, receptive to dehumanizing propaganda. My big fear, the one I think we really, really need to prepare for, and I'm pretty sure we won't prepare for, is the consequences of climate change. I think the consequences of climate change will be such that the most dangerous, most toxic forms of dehumanization and this kinds of violence, genocidal violence that flow from these forms of dehumanization are overwhelmingly likely. You know, when parts of the world become unlivable and there are massive refugee problems, people moving into places that don't want them and can't support them, crop failures, food shortages, shifts in centers of power. It's just unbelievably dangerous. And it's not just, you know, it's right to emphasize the physical problems with climate change, rising sea levels and things like that. But I think there's often not sufficient attention given to the social problems of climate change. And I'm deeply worried. And frankly, I'm glad I will be dead before this stuff happens.
Well, I think I'll still be alive, probably, you know, around your age. And I really dread to see that. In fact, that's why on our channel, we have quite a number of videos where we really do emphasize our concerns for climate change. We're a small country, so, you know, honestly, we can be the greenest country on earth. It wouldn't make a dent.
Wouldn't make a dent. No.
Yeah. So, you know, you brought up that example, you know, your wife saying, you know, the moment we wake up, we sin, and, you know, you mentioned something about something you were eating, you were consuming, and you recognize that, right? Like you could be part of the system of oppression. And actually, I did clip out that one. I love that example from your book where you talk about chocolate. You know, people buy chocolate, right? Like commercial chocolate, but they don't realize that commercial chocolate is produced in West Africa, where child slaves work on cocoa farms, right? They're in terrible conditions. They're beaten, they're abused, they're deprived of education, backbreaking labor. And you know, I love excerpts like that because it makes you really think really hard about, like, okay, I am part of a system. You know, I don't eat chocolate, but but you know, that doesn't help, right? Like, because I'm still part of it, and it's not, you know, polite to go around telling people that, you know, they obviously, as you said, they can resent very strongly to you trying to explain the true reality behind you know, the things that we consume. And that goes into, I guess, the whole bystander and you know, the tension that we were talking about. But anyway, I want to get back into now a little bit academically speaking about the concept of dehumanization, because we have been talking around a little bit. Santosh, you know, you mentioned things like, you know, being a witness to racism and, you know, potentially acts of dehumanization. But I know, David, the way that you talk about dehumanization is very precise. You don't like it to be conflated with related cousins, so to speak, like racism, misogyny, homophobia. So, so from what I've been able to summarize and understand, there's basically two additional layers that's exclusive to the phenomenon of dehumanization. So basically, as you mentioned, they are conceived as monsters and yet human, which is something we will have to, you know, it's tricky. We're going to have to talk about that. How is that even possible? And they obviously pose a serious physical, metaphysical, and moral threat. Now, so this is the part that it gets a little bit theoretical. So after reading your book, and I also noticed this technical extensive review of dehumanization that was published earlier this year, right? And I do notice some scholars have offered a theory of dehumanization that kind of, for me at least, it comes close to my kind of intuitions, which is, I think there's a kind of like progression ladder or spectrum of dehumanization. And so while these other vices that you mentioned, like racism, sexism, ableism, yes, in itself, they're not dehumanization per se, but I see them as kind of like stepping stones. And, you know, when pushed to the extreme, they then manifest into, well, you know, maybe you want to call it proto-dehumanization or something like that. So, and I also found this like chart, right? It's like a 10-stage theory of genocide. And dehumanization is categorized as stage 4. And stage 1 to 3 is division. symbolism, meaning like hate speech and discrimination. But David, I wanted to tickle your brain. So I understand you disagree with this kind of conceptualization. So can you explain what's wrong with this idea about spectrum and trying to make things more heterogeneous?
Okay. Well, part of it is pragmatic. So given my relatively precise definition of dehumanization, there are lots of what I call nearby phenomena, things that are kind of related to conceiving of others as less than human creatures, but not exactly that. Now, I'm a big fan of making distinctions, particularly about these really serious matters. So all of these things are bad, right? Racism is bad. Homophobia is bad. Sexism is bad. Ableism is bad. All these things are bad. All these things are things we should want to do something about. To do something about them, we need to understand them. And I think it obscures understanding to lump them all together under one label. So if we make distinctions, then we can identify the dynamics that are distinctive to each of these things. And we stand a much better chance of intervening in an effective manner. So of course, one could be a pluralist about dehumanization. I can think of at least one scholar who uses the term dehumanization as sort of an umbrella under which all of these things are placed. And that's not incorrect, but I don't think it's helpful. So it's on the level of what's helpful and what's not helpful that I make the choice that I do. Now, there is a deeper issue here, because we can understand spectrum in a couple of different ways. The way you intended it there was sort of to use a metaphor, a horizontal spectrum, right? So there's ableism and there's racism and there's sexism and so on, and these kind of merge into each other. I'm also disagree with the idea that when we dehumanize others, we see them as less human than ourselves. So the reason I disagree with that is I think that making a judgment about humanness, and there are deep questions around, what that means. Like when we say someone is human, what are we talking about? When we make judgments, when we attribute humanness to others, I think it's absolute. And that has to do with the essentialism that you mentioned earlier on as a component of dehumanizing thought. Right? So it's not like humanness is incremental, that you can be kind of human and kind of not human, more or less human. Humanness, I think judgments of humanness are absolute. They're digital rather than analog. You're either in or you're out of the club. Now, there was another point associated with this, which has slipped my mind entirely. What did I want to say? No, we'll leave it. It'll come back.
Sure.
Rather than me sitting silently trying to remember.
Yeah, no worries. Because I will have a question that's kind of related to this. But maybe it might help to just put this in here right now. Because the way that I'm thinking of it is, and it's, okay, the bigger question I have to ask you is that you've obviously mentioned that scholars, other, maybe philosophers and psychologists, maybe they're very skeptical or critical of the word, of the concept of dehumanization. And I was wondering, might it be more receptive to them if you consider dehumanization as a form of pathology? So like I said, from that paper that I saw, I understand there's certain kind of constructs or measurements, right? And what I'm wondering is that because you make a very important philosophical point, right, which is dehumanize people, the people who dehumanize others are not insane. And because you put it that way, so maybe to, observers or to people even like us, who don't have that kind of training, right, in philosophy and psychology as you do, like we may find that really befuddling. Like, what do you mean? Because quite clearly there's something wrong with these people. And actually, one counterpoint I have for you is because you yourself mentioned that we're not natural born dehumanizers. So to me, that speaks of a very important point, which is, okay, then normally human beings are not dehumanizers. So, that's kind of like what I'm thinking.
Yeah. So one reason I don't consider dehumanization a pathology is because I think that would be a lie. It's not, and in fact, it involves just the term pathology involves what's basically a medicalization of something which isn't medical at all. We're medicalizing a feature of the human condition, and we're medicalizing a kind of responsiveness to ideology and political forces. I think we should think of it that way. A second reason is that if we pathologize dehumanization, well, this is a way of distancing ourselves. It's like saying there are these sick people, these sick Nazis, and they're not like me. And just by the way, what often goes with this is not merely that they're mad, which descriptively was not the case at all. There's no evidence that any of the senior Nazis were psychiatrically disturbed, but they're monsters, right? Hitler was a monster, Stalin was a monster. No, they're not. And it's very, very important to look into the mirror that they hold up to us, that we can see our own reflection in, rather than treating them as so wholly other and defective. That is, if we want to do something about dehumanization, we need to recognize those propensities in ourselves. Otherwise, we're easy victims of dehumanizing propaganda.
Okay, let me then ask you about that thing that you did mention earlier about how you change your definition from subhumans to monsters. So that, I think, is the major update from your book, from what I mentioned earlier, the earlier book, to your latest one. And I'm just going to give the reader, give the viewer some examples of examples you've used previously, right? So you once described, you cited cases where a United States Marine Corps magazine published I don't know, is it satirical or is it meant to be serious, but it's a piece.
No, it's meant to be funny.
Okay, so it's a satirical piece on a parasite that has stereotypical Japanese features, and they did that before they firebombed Japan. In Germany, Jews were obviously labeled subhumans, likened to vermin and maggots. Buddhist monks in Myanmar have described the persecuted Rohingya population as reincarnated snakes and scorpions. And then, of course, there's one from Israel, which is the ex-Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who described Palestinians as predatory beasts. And you aptly pointed out, he didn't apply the same epithet to Jewish extremists who retaliated by burning a Palestinian boy. And of course, your point is that all this rhetoric is really important, right? Because it enables the attitude, the psychology that you mentioned, that certain groups that we dealt with the kind of moralistic and guiltless violence, right? That you inflict on pests. Now you change it. Now you conceive dehumanization as you say, like as both human and monsters, and you understand this is very illogical, because how can one be X and Y at the same time? But for me, actually, okay, I'm going to come up and say that I'm actually pretty sold on your theory for one fundamental reason, and that is because I think human beings are very capable of holding two contradictory thoughts in their heads. And this ability philosophically is a gift and a curse, right? So in your book, you discussed the principle of explosion, where you said that if anything is contradictory, you can infer anything from it. And I love the example you used of the Wes Craven movie, Freddy Krueger, because if he can kill you in dreams, then he can kill you in your reality. So in any case, right, I think what I want to ask you to do for our viewers is, can you explain, why this theoretical difference is so important? And, can you just provide us the arguments and the wealth of evidence for this?
Sure. So to do that, let's see okay. No, I can do it while avoiding certain other things, which may come up later. So you're absolutely right. In my 2011 book, Less Than Human, I understood dehumanization as conceiving of others as less than human animals. And of course, there are a lot of examples, certainly of dehumanizing speech, some of which you just mentioned, characterizing other members of our species as subhuman animals. But there are two powerful objections to that view. One has been around in the literature for a while. Nowadays, it's most closely associated with the Cornell University philosopher Kate Manne, which is that although dehumanizers might refer to those whom they at least ostensibly dehumanize as, say, vermin, they don't treat them as vermin. Right? So, for instance, they humiliate them. Well, you don't humiliate vermin. You don't say to a rat, you're nothing but a rat. That just doesn't make any sense. So the idea here is, which for Kate Manne leads to skepticism about dehumanization, is that implicitly dehumanizers recognize the humanness of those that they describe in these ways. Now, I think that argument can be made even stronger because it's often explicit. If you actually look at dehumanizing discourse, historical examples, what you tend to find is an alternation between characterizing the other as human or in terms that are only applicable to humans and characterizing them as subhuman. It's kind of like a flip-flop, it's sort of a duck-rabbit situation, if you're familiar with that image. So for instance, it's very common for a dehumanized population to be described as criminals. Well, there aren't any criminal rats or dogs or wolves or maggots, right? That is a distinctively human characterization. And I give an example it's certainly in On Inhumanity. I don't remember if I put it in Making Monsters, about this a violent pogrom perpetrated in 1993 against Roma people in Romania. And a newspaper reporter is interviewing one of the perpetrators. And in the space of a single paragraph, she goes back and forth. They're human, they're not human, they're human, they're not, apparently not noticing any contradiction to this. Right. So I call that the problem of humanity. And my original theory of dehumanization does not address that at all. The second problem is one that I've written on, criticizing my own work, and I'm not aware of anyone else making it, which is that if we actually look at examples of dehumanization, the dehumanized person is not only described as a less than human animal, they are very often explicitly described, and even more often implicitly described, as monstrous and demonic. Now, there was no room for that in my original account either. So I was faced with, a theoretical problem here. How do I address these two things? And it turned out, and I think I'm right about this, that one very important central modification to my thesis covers both of those. So to explain that, let's consider Nazi anti-Semitism, right? So let's pretend that you're both convinced Nazis. I know that you're not. And let's say that I'm a Jewish man, which I am. And according to the ideology, I'm something like a rat. But if you see me as something like a rat, here's what you're not imagining, that I'm a small, brown, furry creature with a long pink tail. That's not what you're thinking. You're thinking something different. And what I think is going on for you is best captured by the image of superimposing a picture of a rat onto me. And if you can imagine that, then what I'm trying to give you is a graphic image of the idea that you hold two simultaneous representations of me in sort of different mental compartments. On one hand, you've been convinced by the propaganda and ideology that I'm not really a human being, that I'm something like a rat. But on the other hand, you can't help see me as a human being. And I think there are very, very important psychological reasons for that. So here you are, you're engaging with me, and my theory predicts the more intimate the connection, the more sharp this problem is going to be. And you are seeing me not as a rat and not as a human, but as a rat human, which is contradictory. You can't be both. But I should point out, psychology is not logic, right? And this is something philosophers often don't get because they idealize logic so much. We don't operate that way. We're perfectly capable of sustaining contradictions, and we all do it. And it's probably essential for our well-being that we do so. Okay, so on the one hand, I'm a rat. On the other hand, I'm a human. And that has a very particular effect. But before I go into that effect, I want you to consider how it addresses the problem of humanity that I described. So, of course, dehumanized people are seen as human. If the dehumanizer has a representation of them as human, which no matter how hard they try, they can't get rid of, because we as highly, highly social animals, just automatically, when we're confronted with the side of a human face, we respond to it as another human being. It's automatic. We can't turn it off. It's there. So of course that's present. And of course that alternates with its contradiction, that the idea, the representation of the dehumanized person as a subhuman animal. And there's actually another very important consideration, which is how this idea comes about, which has to do with political forces and propaganda and ideology and so on, which maybe we'll get into. It also solves the problem of monstrosity. That is the problem that dehumanized people are often represented as demonic, monstrous beings. So to explain this, I have to do a little bit of intellectual history. And if I ramble too much, you can always tell me to shut up, right? That's not a problem. I say that to my students all the time. They never take me up on it.
No, it's okay. I think it's good. Let's get into that a little bit, and then after which, I probably should let Santosh also have a word in. But go ahead, David. Give us intellectual history.
Okay. So there are several scholars who have independently engaged in research with a bearing on this. And the first, and I think one of the most important, was a German psychiatrist named Ernst Jentsch, who published a paper in 1906 called On the Psychology of the Uncanny. Now, the term uncanny, the German is unheimlich, and what he meant by unheimlich was not quite the way people use the word uncanny in English. It's something that's unheimlich. The way he was using the term is disturbing in a very special way. It's creepy. It borders on the horrific. And what Jentsch was trying to do is figure out the origins of this distinctive emotion. And basically his conclusion was that we experience things as uncanny, unheimlich, creepy, if our minds are torn between two incompatible interpretations of what we're presented with. So one of his really good examples are figures in a wax museum. They look very realistic. And when you first encounter them, it's like seeing another person. But then you see that it's not quite. It's dead, its skin is waxy, the eyes are sort of not alive like real human eyes. And
I do agree that's creepy.
Yeah, that's really creepy. Well, why is it creepy? Because you're at the same time seeing them as human beings. That's the gut level response, and recognizing that they're inanimate lumps of wax. Now, Jens thought that once your mind could settle on one interpretation or the other, then they're no longer creepy. And he applies this to, say, corpses. It's dad lying there in the coffin. No, it's a slab of inert flesh. So as long as you're torn, there's something disturbing about the side of the corpse. This general idea was independently rediscovered by a Japanese roboticist named Masahiro Mori in a very famous paper called Bukimi no Tani, published in 1970. And Mori predicted that as robots become more and more humanoid, we'll become more and more comfortable with them until they're almost, but not quite, indistinguishable. And at that point, we drop into what I like to call the valley of creepiness. The uncanny valley is the canonical translation of his terminology. So you see there's something very similar here. The robot that's almost indistinguishable from a human being, but not quite, is experienced as disturbing, as creepy, as eerie. Now, there are several other scholars in this lineage. Anthropologist Mary Douglas, for instance, writing in 1966. But the person I want to get to is a philosopher named Noel Carroll. Carroll does aesthetics, and one of his interests is horror fiction. One of the questions he asks in his wonderful book, The Philosophy of Horror, is what makes a monster? The monster of horror fiction. What are the requirements for this? And he argues there are two requirements. One is the monster has to be physically threatening. Like the monster has to want to hurt you, right? There aren't any nice monsters in horror. But that doesn't distinguish monsters from other dangerous things, right? It doesn't distinguish them from serial killers or terrorists or grizzly bears or, all these things. The monster also has to be what he calls cognitively threatening, and I call metaphysically threatening. And what's meant by that is the monster has to be an impossible combination of different kinds of things. And that really amplifies the sense of danger. And I think I understand why that is too, but that's another matter. So you can go through the horror movie canon, and you see this again and again. So zombies, for instance, are both alive and dead simultaneously. They're decaying corpses, but they want to eat your brains and they move around. Werewolves are wolves and people at the same time, and so on. So what we have in the monster scenario is this element of physical danger, plus the monster is a combination of two incompatible things at once. Now that brings us back to the dehumanization issue, right? So if it's the case that when people dehumanize others, they see them both as human and subhuman simultaneously, and as is the case in the most dangerous and toxic forms of dehumanization. They also see them as physically threatening. That's often a precursor to dehumanization. They're criminal, they're rapists, they're terrorists, and so on. Then we have, by this kind of alchemy, we have created monsters. And one of the tragedies of this is, monsters are really scary and really powerful. And it's often the most vulnerable, the most marginalized members of a population who are transformed in this way into monsters in the eyes of their persecutors. The people who most need support, who most need protection, become seen as the most formidably dangerous beings. So it was very wordy, but that's the short version of the story of where my work has moved over the last 10 years.
Yeah, to get the long version, you just need to buy the book and read it. So
exactly.
So I usually if one thing I want to say, then I want to ask you, get Santosh to have a word in. So I don't think the two of you are familiar with what's going on with current pop culture, but one example, a long-running zombie TV series called The Walking Dead. And in The Walking Dead, where the characters, the protagonists, and all the other cast, they live in this zombified world. And actually, the show is very explicit that the title of The Walking Dead is not a reference to the zombies itself. It's a reference to the human beings, because they constantly encounter threats of other human groups who want to brutalize, dehumanize, and to
Wow.
I've got
to watch this now.
Yeah, it's a long-running comic graphic novel or comic series, and then it got converted into a TV series. It's been running for many seasons now. But what I wanted to say was that I think nowadays, actually, in like I say, pop culture, there is this trope that is been circulating, which is we don't focus on the monsters anymore. We focus on the humans, because the humans are discernibly vicious and intentionally much more malicious than the monsters themselves.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, Santosh,
that's great. That sounds really interesting.
Yeah. I can maybe give you some references. Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah. Santosh, you want to have a word?
I mean, the thing that came to my mind was why would you want to dehumanize a segment of the population that is marginalized and that has got less resources already? And it's a question that's always on my mind. But I mean, what I wanted to talk about, apart from this question in my mind, was the realm of social psychology. And I'm just going to quote an excerpt from your book, right? So we are innately biased against outsiders. This bias is seized upon and manipulated by indoctrination and propaganda to motivate men and women to slaughter one another. This is done by inducing men to regard their enemies as subhuman creatures, which overrides their natural biological inhibitions against killing. So dehumanization has the specific function of unleashing aggression in war. So this is a cultural process, not a biological one, but it has to piggyback on biological adaptations in order to be effective. Yeah, so this is, I think this is a nice segue to what you mentioned just now. And then something about social psychologists who confirm that we are likely to perceive people outside our own community as more alike than those within it. So we perceive members of our own group as individuals, like highly differentiated individuals, but see other groups as more or less homogeneous. So psychologists call this the outgroup homogeneity bias. So the closer we judge a creature is to us on the hierarchy, the more inclined we are to grant it moral standing. So this is something else that I came across in your works. Yeah. So there's just a lot of material here, and I'm like trying to figure out why would we? Yeah.
Okay.
So can I tackle on one question to this as well? Because I actually wanted to ask you something even deeper than this. So I think this segues, with what Santosh was saying, because you have these two tensions or these two forces, right? Biological and social cultural forces. And, as I alluded to earlier, you are someone who is deeply influenced by Sigmund Freud, right? And Sigmund Freud is, grandfather of psychology. He believed, the central idea, the central takeaway from Freud is that we have a unconscious drive, right? And you also actually, David, have contributed to a book called Biophilosophy, how biology shapes philosophy. So, and then at the same time, I find in your own words, right, you wrote something about like how a huge part of human nature is our capacity to use culture to engineer human nature itself for good or for ill. We are, to a great extent, the architects of our own nature. And just for our viewers to know, so we actually did a earlier video where we talk about essentialism philosophically, and we debated about different types of essentialism: psychological essentialism, biological essentialism. So that's just for our viewers to know. Watch some of our other older videos. But now, David, my question to you is that, so what I want to ask you is, how important is it to you, right, to discern between the influence of science and philosophy? And how do you come to this account of human nature, right? You got these two different texts, and where do you exactly sit on this nature-nurture debate? Yeah.
Okay. Well, my view is that the world isn't organized like a university with separate departments. So what I see myself doing, and what I see scholars who I most respect generally doing, is simply trying to solve a problem using whatever means are available. So I don't have any notion of, if you're a philosopher, you research things philosophically, and if you're a psychologist, you research things psychologically. There's no, to quote Daniel Dennett, there's no philosophy-free science. And I would go the other way too. There's no science-free philosophy, because to do philosophical work, maybe I should modify that. To do meaningful philosophical work, we need to take account of the world and how the world is and reality. And science is our best way of understanding that. So I think one reason that research into dehumanization has not progressed as it should, given the importance of the phenomenon, is that dehumanization stands at the interface between several different disciplines, right? You cannot understand dehumanization, in my view, without understanding human psychology and cognitive biases, such as the essentialism bias and so on. You can't understand dehumanization without taking account of the fact that we are by nature an ultra-social species. You cannot understand dehumanization without addressing the way that ideology and propaganda work, and the way that political and economic and social forces impact on human behavior. You need all of that. And any account of dehumanization that leaves out even one of those things is going to be impoverished. But that's very challenging. It's very challenging partially because in higher education, in academic settings, this sort of interdisciplinarity is not incentivized, right? There's a lot of talk about it, but the structures in place do not promote it. It also requires us to do something intellectually really difficult, which is to find some kind of unified theoretical vocabulary that can pull all of these things in, right? These things, which are not really separate, they're different kinds of perspectives. They're not separate phenomena, they're different perspectives on a large, complex phenomenon, which is dehumanization. So nature and nurture, I think the very idea is mistaken. got that metaphor from Shakespeare, and it sounds good, but it misrepresents the world. First of all, isn't nurture part of nature? Isn't nature part of nurture? So I think we should abandon this whole way of thinking. There are, and I try to avoid, just by the way, using terms like innate now. There's certain contexts where I'll use it because it's a deeply confusing term. It means too many different things. I avoid the term human nature as much as I can. Sometimes I use it because it entices us to be essentialists about our own species. So, yeah, we are animals with certain propensities. One of them is the propensity to create culture, which then engineers our behavior. We can self-engineer our behavior. That gives us tremendous behavioral flexibility, but it also creates vulnerabilities. And it creates vulnerabilities, of course, because we can engineer our behavior through cultural means to be better than we would otherwise be, and also worse than we would otherwise be. So, you know, when people ask me about nature and nurture, my first response is usually, explain to me what you're talking about, really. Like, what is it? What is the question that I'm supposed to address? Are there persistent human traits? Of course there are. Of course there are. Are those sometimes products of our evolutionary history? Of course that's the case, right? I can grant that. I think, but I'm somewhat skeptical at this point in my intellectual career of the claims of, say, evolutionary psychologists, which I think overestimate those things and draw sweeping conclusions from very, very partial and limited evidence. So in my thinking, right, in my thinking about these things, what do I see as, quote, nature? Well, certainly our ultra-sociality. I think that's indisputable. We're social primates. And we are exceptionally social primates. No primate comes anywhere near our degree of sociality. I think a biological evolutionary explanation of that is correct. Our tendency to essentialize, I don't know. I don't know. I'm kind of neutral on that. I don't know if this is in any sense built into the human mind or it's a cultural product that's been handed down from one generation to the next. Our tendency to think hierarchically, which is so vital for my theory of dehumanization, I think that's entirely cultural and ideological. But it's a solution to kind of a problem in living, which is proven to be very robust. That's why we have it. So it's a mix. I try to be cautious about, you know, claims about human nature and claims about, again, in scare quotes, innateness.
Yeah, let me pop one more question about that, because then we can get quite specific. And I actually think this question will be of interest to Santosh, because I think Santosh has a very positive, rosy-eyed view about human nature, that human beings are generally, you know, pro-social, empathetic. But David, you wrote a very critical review of a very popular book called Humankind by Rugged and Bregman. I actually did like the book, but I totally understand there's a lot to be critical about regarding his arguments. And, you know, I read your review and I understand that basically it's kind of like a quote unquote take down piece on basically any kind of account, right? That's an essentialist account of like human nature being good and decent. And in particular, you seem quite critical, from what I extract from your essay, of two kind of fallacious reasoning. So one is that prehistoric societies provide that window into discovering man's true nature. So I feel like you're rebutting Rousseau's, noble savage idea, and that you don't think it's actually very useful to study infants, simply because they are exempt from the effects of socialization. It doesn't mean that they provide the essence of human nature. But there is a couple of texts I want to ask you about. So there is this new book called The Dawn of Everything. It's written by two other Davids, David Wengro and David Graeber, who's no longer unfortunately with us, right? And they have argued that actually pre-modern societies are a lot more varied, diverse, freer than we thought.
Yeah.
So it kind of leads to the implication that, civilization, like our kind of civilization, we don't have to sacrifice principles of egalitarianism, freedom, and you kind of redesign them, right? And with the latter, the one about studying infants, well, you have your amicable colleague Paul Bloom, who wrote the book Just Babies, where he argued that morality is something that we are born with, and babies are endowed with compassion, empathy, and the beginnings of a sense of fairness. So what do you make of this? There seems to be competing theses to your ideas.
Yeah, so I entirely agree with the let me put that slightly differently. I too assume that prehistoric societies were varied. We think of them as homogenous. Why? These were different cultures, right? They were no less cultural than our societies today.
Let me make one point, David. Sorry. Yeah. Let me make one point, because something that we talk about on our show, and we have this sometimes, what I feel, romanticization of indigenous culture or prehistoric societies. We imagine that they're free from dehumanization. But what I did like from your book is that you said that humanization is very perverse. It's found in all sorts of cultures and ancient societies as well. Yeah.
That's true. Yeah. So some historians of ideas think that this is a modern and distinctively European phenomenon. It's certainly not. It's certainly not. Yeah, people are varied, cultures are varied, and babies are varied too, right? To say that babies I think to call babies and toddlers pro-social behavior morality is a bit of a stretch. I might want to consider it a building block of morality or some kinds of morality, but not all morality is compassionate, by the way, right? So let's take Nazis. They were extraordinarily moralistic. The genocide, the Holocaust was highly moralistic. There's a famous speech by Himmler, which I believe I mentioned in my review of Bregman's book, where he took place in Poland, and he's speaking to SS officers. We have a recording of the speech, and he's talking about the moral fiber it takes to basically to kill people, to do your duty, to overcome the human weakness of repugnance when you see 1,000 corpses lined up. So I think that is equally can lay claim to morality as those acts that you and I would be inclined to approve of, right? So I think that's the case. Here's what I think Paul Bloom is right about here, and what I think Rutger Bregman is right about, that we are highly social animals, and we have a set of inhibitions against doing serious harm to one another, right? I think that is the case. And that's why I was disappointed with Bregman's book, actually, because I don't think he argued that well. I think his argumentation was very undisciplined and reinforced the very essentialism that I think is so dangerous. So the way I see it then is that we have these dispositions, we have these highly social dispositions, which every normal human being has, to be social and to find it difficult to do lethal and even sublethal harm to one another. But we also have the means, clever apes that we are, of disabling those inhibitions. And that's through cultural means, right? Now, this is not a Rousseau kind of position. I'm not saying culture, that culture gets us also to do really wonderful things, right? It's culture that allows us to lay down on the table, be put to sleep, and allow someone to cut into our bodies to save our lives. No chimpanzee would permit that, right? So we can culturally engineer ourselves by exploiting certain psychological dispositions to do awful things, to disable the inhibitions that evolution has endowed us with as part of our highly social nature. So this is a complex interplay of forces.
So I do have a question that pertains to the social cultural forces. But Santosh, you want to ask something first before I go with it? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to be a bit of a long, not rant, but something I want to explain, David, so that I give you the full context. So of course you wrote an article about Whoopi Goldberg being recently suspended, right, due to her blunder of trying to describe the Holocaust as not being an issue of race. And of course in your article you talk about how people make the erroneous assumption that race is about looks when it's not about that, right? The history of dehumanization shows that the Nazis or the white supremacists, they search for more insidious factors like bloodline, right? And it's because of looking for this kind of insidious factors that's why they essentialize, the dehumanize, right? Yeah. So I'm going to now, and of course actually the funny thing about Whoopi Goldberg was that she didn't even realize that at the alt-right rally at Charlottesville, right? I mean, they were literally shouting blood and soil. So I think that's an obvious enough reference, right? But here's where I'm going to go a little bit, like I'm kind of hypothesizing here a little bit. And, I'm thinking very hard about what you said about bloodline and essentialism and all that. And I feel that maybe by now that kind of language is a bit outdated. And I'm going to explain what I mean. Like you mentioned social cultural factors, right? That exacerbate dehumanization. So I think the modern anti-Semite is not necessarily going to find fault with the idea of a Jewish blood being responsible for whatever they find wrong with Jewish people, but it's the whole social cultural tradition of, the whole social cultural foundation of Jewish tradition. And I give you an example. So consider Trump, right? And I know you don't like Trump. I know that you consider him a very dangerous person, right? And I agree wholeheartedly with that. And that's why I bring him up a lot of times because I think people don't take him seriously enough. So he's obviously a bona fide racist, and he's a figurehead for the anti-Semite, actually, right? But his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is a Jew. And Trump himself has been invited to many prestigious Jewish business lobby events, issuing very anti-Semite tropes. And I'm going to quote one of them. He said to the Israel-American Council in Hollywood, "A lot of you are in the real estate business because I know you very well. You're brutal killers, not nice people at all. But you have to vote for me. You have no choice. You're not going to vote for Pocahontas. I can tell you that. That's Elizabeth Warren. You're not going to vote for the wealth tax. Some of you don't like me. Some of you I don't like at all. But you're going to be my biggest supporters because you're going to be out of business in about 15 minutes if they get it." I assume he means the Democrats. And what I'm thinking, like putting all this together, right? What I'm trying to say to you is that I think maybe that explains Whoopi's ignorance as well, because maybe people don't no longer think about the bloodline issue, or even the as you said, maybe the current label is genomes, right? Like genetics.
Yes.
Maybe people are thinking, in an anti-Semite, dehumanizing way, using social cultural explanations. Yeah. So what do you think? Do you think there's something to what I said? Like there is a shift in the discourse.
Yeah. One of my phrases I like to use is that scratch a social constructionist and a biological realist bleeds. And what I mean by that is overtly sociocultural characterizations. Often when you push a person a little bit, you find that they think there's some deeper reason why these sociocultural stereotypes apply. And that has to do with the fundamental nature of the group of people involved. right. So that being said, and you're absolutely right, fantasies about blood have largely been replaced by fantasies about genetics, which are equally fantasies. That being said, of course, groups of people like Jewish people are not under all circumstances racialized. The problem with Whoopi Goldberg's comment was her implication that Nazis did not racialize Jews, which is absurd, right? Groups of people can be racialized and they can be unracialized. If you look at the history of race, you find that all the time. In the United States right now, I think that Muslims are racialized. I think Muslim has become, in effect, a racial category. That wasn't always the case, right? So the way people are racialized is sort of hostage to whatever social and political forces are active in that ecology. And that this actually relates to something that Santosh mentioned and I didn't remark on. So maybe I can use this opportunity to put this in. So I said there's Santosh, you expressed puzzlement that people without resources, vulnerable people, are seen as monsters. And how does that happen? Well, I don't think it happens spontaneously. I don't think people wake up one morning and say, those people, they're different. They must be less than human. I think it's a product of political processes. So there's not one example of dehumanization that I've looked at. Now, I didn't recognize this in my first book on dehumanization at all, where people have not been moved either by propaganda, political propaganda, or in sort of entrenched ideologies that have become part of a culture. And generally it's both. So what happens is there's a culture with a long ideological history of oppressing or denigrating a subpopulation. And then something changes, and that something tends to be a factor that makes the majority feel vulnerable. You combine that with a skillful propagandist like Wiratu in Myanmar. And it's like lighting a match to dry wood that's been sitting there. And it's actually really disturbing. Douglas, you'll know because you read Making Monsters. I have that extended study of anti-Semitism from over 2,000 years. And one of the really saddening things about doing that investigation was recognizing how persistent and robust these ideas are. They can seem to disappear, and then things change a little bit, and bang, they're back with tremendous force. That's really disturbing. But we have to look to understand why dehumanization happens. It's very important. We have to look at a feature of human culture, which has been wonderful for us, but also terrible for us. And that feature is the cognitive division of labor. So we have experts on things. Thank God, when we want to build a bridge, there are expert engineers that know how to design bridges. The world would be a much worse place if that weren't the case. And we epistemically defer to these experts. So to use my favorite example, which I think I use every time I have a conversation like this, the table in front of me looks like a solid thing with no gaps. The physicists tell me it's mostly empty space. And even the atoms that compose it are not touching each other. Well, that's not what my eyes tell me, but I accept what the physicist tells me. And no matter how hard I try, I can't see it as mostly empty space. But nonetheless, I treat that as my limitation, that My assessment of reality is through my eyes in this case, and I accept what the physicist says. Why? Because the physicist is the person who is supposed to know. Now, the problem is that there are others who are supposed to know, who use their authority to convince us that others who look like us are not really our kind at all. They might look human, but they're not human on the inside. They're vermin, or they're demonic, or whatever the dehumanizing trope is. And just like with the physicist, even though our eyes don't tell us this, if we invest authority in these people, they might be scientists. There's a long, terrible history of scientists promoting dehumanization and other atrocities. They might be celebrities. They might be talk show hosts. They might be politicians. If we invest them with that authority, if we treat them as those who are supposed to know, then we're likely to defer to their views, especially if their views cohere with culturally entrenched biases, right? So in my view, dehumanization comes from the outside, it doesn't come from the inside. It comes from the outside, but it can only affect behavior by engaging with psychological dispositions that are on the inside.
So many a times you've mentioned social cultural factors. And one of the things I want to ask you is about economic conditions, because I think that's a very understudied area. And obviously, we have the case of Germany turning to fascism and Nazism because of the tremendous economic devastation that they suffered as a country from World War I. But I'm wondering about other case studies. So whether it's the lynching of the blacks, the Rwanda genocide, persecution of the Rohingya people, and I'm sure that we have more examples in mind.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, have there been particular economic factors that have contributed significantly to the spread of dehumanization? And further to that, right? I mean, because we on the show talk a bit about the flaws of capitalism. So I also want to ask you, does economic scarcity, capitalism's idea of artificial scarcity, hyper-competitiveness, hierarchy of social status, does that contribute as well?
Any of these things can contribute, and you would get I try to avoid talking about things that I don't have sufficient knowledge of. So I think a political economist would give you a much more reliable picture than anything I can say. Economic pressure is often a factor in eruptions of dehumanization. But I think what's important is why it's often a factor. So we shouldn't think of the social conditions that promote dehumanizations in a monocausal way, right? It's not like one key to unlock the door there. And here, let me go to Freud. So I have been really, really influenced by, in the first instance, by Freud's analysis of religion in his book, The Future of an Illusion. Now, in the book, he's basically talking about Christianity, and somewhat more broadly, the monotheisms, the Abrahamic religions. And he's concerned with the psychology of this sort of religious belief. And basically, his story goes like this. We human beings are vulnerable, and we know we're vulnerable. In our heart of hearts, we all know we're vulnerable. We're vulnerable to the forces of nature that will kill us. We're vulnerable to human injustice. And that awareness of vulnerability leads us to yearn for some kind of salvation from the human condition, some kind of protection, so maybe we won't really die. Maybe we are ultimately protected from the forces of nature. And maybe, because it does not happen in this world, in another world, those who do evil will be punished and those who do good will be rewarded. So it corrects injustice. And what he says, I think, is very deeply compassionate. He says religion expresses the oldest, most powerful, the deepest wishes of mankind, of salvation from vulnerability. Now, one of the things that Freud doesn't recognize at all, and this is typical of Freud's blind spot, is that children don't just one day decide that, Jesus is their savior, right? They have to be exposed to these ideas and indoctrinated. Religion has to be offered to them. Now, a psychoanalyst who did recognize this, but in a somewhat different sphere, was a man named Roger Monicarl. Now, Monicarl wrote a paper, which he doesn't explicitly talk about Freud's views on religion, but I think it's in the background. And it was a paper discussing his observations of Hitler's rallies. He went to Germany and he observed Hitler and Goebbels doing their song and dance, their rallies. And basically, his conclusion was that Nazi propaganda worked by first making people feel even more vulnerable and then offering them a magical solution, offering them salvation. And he said there were 3 steps. The first was to make them depressed. Everything's helpless. The world is exploiting us. We've been humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles in the German case. We've betrayed our great destiny. It's all our fault. Then making them feel paranoid. Yeah, but it's not really you. You see, it's the communists and the Jews. They're destroying us. They're plotting behind our backs. And then offering the magical solution. Join the Nazi party. We will triumph. Our race will triumph. We'll have the 1,000-year Reich, etc., etc. Now, what really strikes me about that is the commonality between authoritarian politics and certain forms of monotheistic religious indoctrination. Just as in the case with the yearning for the religious savior, we have in authoritarian politics the yearning for the political savior, who is actually seen as godlike, omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent. So anything the leader says is true just because the leader says it, right? The leader is all good. The leader is all powerful. I think that's really important. And I think now to come around to what I was trying to address and what you said, anything that induces a sense of vulnerability is available for exploitation by clever propagandists who then induce surplus vulnerability, right? So it becomes easier for them to both scare us, make us depressed, scare us, and then offer us salvation through loyalty to them than would otherwise be the case. And economic hardship is one such factor. It's not the only one, but it's one such factor, and it's an important one.
Yeah, and because you use such grand historical account of this, the other thing that I had in my mind was that maybe one way we can relate to anyone who's watching this video, anyone who's reading your work, right, from this very large scale events, let's talk about smaller, what I want to call like pockets of dehumanization. So I want to offer you one very recent example. So Tesla, the company owned by Elon Musk, was recently hit with several discrimination lawsuits alleging rampant racism that went on unabated for years. So I'm just going to give a quick account. So Black workers reported that they were subjected to racial slurs, drawings, assigned physically demanding jobs. Terms like slave ship, plantation, crack the whip were thrown around. The workers report derogatory comments from their superiors, even including hearing racial slurs as often as 50 to 100 times a day, being called the N-word and hood rats. There were racist graffiti and swastikas, KKK, N-word, other racist writings that Tesla did not remove for months. And what I was thinking about in reciting this case to you, David, is that I'm sure maybe, to a theoretician, maybe someone might say, hey, this is just a very extreme case of racism or workplace racism, right, and discrimination. But really what I want to ask you is that, okay, but we just don't have access to the thoughts and the ideas of Elon Musk and the management, right? So how can we just assume that hence this is not actually, that it's not impossible for this case to meet the definition of dehumanization? Because as you mentioned, right, it's not just about degradativism, it's not just about degrading treatment. I mean, what I'm asking is that isn't the effects pretty similar enough, right? And why I bring this up is because I think maybe it's hard for people to see from something as big and as historic as the Holocaust, right, are not able to observe, like I said, smaller pockets of dehumanization that's floating around.
Yeah. So there are methodological difficulties, speaking from a purely theoretical standpoint. It's often difficult to decide whether a given phenomenon is an example of genuine dehumanization or not, precisely because we don't have access to people's minds. And, not every case of apparent dehumanization is genuine dehumanization, in my view. And I think one of the projects I'm working on is trying to find indirect means of making a call on this. But that being said, part of my thesis is that racism is very closely linked to dehumanization. That's why I call dehumanization racism on steroids. Pardon me. So racist attitudes conform to the same general pattern as dehumanizing attitudes. So when people are racialized, now this could get a little bit complicated because my view is that the very idea of race is inseparable from racism. Racism is built into race because when you racialize people, you think of them as lower on the human hierarchy than whoever you happen to be, right? So it's a hierarchical thing. People in ordinary racism or in ordinary racist attitudes, I say attitudes because racism means a lot of different things too. The racialized person is still regarded as a human being, but as a defective, inferior human being, a human being of less intrinsic value, a human being whose life doesn't matter as much. And the racialized person is seen as possessing a racial essence. Being a member of one race or another is a life sentence. It's unchangeable. You're basically stuck with it. And membership in a racial group is handed on biologically from parents to offspring. That's how I think the idea of race works. And I think it covers all of the cases we'd want to cover. Dehumanization takes that a step further. So not only is the individual an inferior form of human life, they're not even a form of human life. So they're demoted further on the hierarchy of living things. In actual practice, I don't think it's terribly important in cases like you described to be able to decide, is this racism? Is it dehumanization? Well, who knows? I mean, there's a whole gray area. Maybe it's kind of dehumanization, kind of racism. That doesn't matter so much. What matters is that it's terrible. And it's, see, I think I think in the United States, people of African descent are very, very often dehumanized, even though it's not explicit, right? So the idea of essential Black criminality, which is an idea that many, many white people harbor in the back of their minds, without saying it, That's just a secular version of Black people, particularly Black men, as demonic, as monstrous, as essentially, as bad to the bone. Another dehumanizing assumption, which we even find in the medical profession, is that Black people don't suffer, right? They have reduced capacity to feel pain, and they certainly don't suffer in a spiritual or emotional way. My suspicion is that reflects a genuinely dehumanizing attitude. And it's extraordinarily prevalent and will be prevalent until, which I don't think is ever going to happen, by the way, the United States confronts its history properly.
Yeah, I share that bit of pessimism. I just want to check on time. Are you still good to go on for, say, I don't know, 15 minutes or half an hour more?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Santosh, what about you?
I'm okay. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay, I just want to bring in, because we have a third co-host and he couldn't be with us tonight. I want to bring in his question. So it pertains to everything you just said just now, David, about hierarchy and about, the very important concept in your book about the great chain of being. And so now let's talk a little bit about, per se, even though we're being very pessimistic, but solutions or ways to ameliorate or resist dehumanization. So the question really is this. Do you think that one way we can resolve this, right, dehumanization, is to stop thinking that there's anything special about human beings, meaning that we lose the anthropocentric perspective? Now, I don't think it's possible, but I'm curious to hear what you think.
I don't think it's possible to lose it. And it probably wouldn't be desirable. It wouldn't be an unmixed blessing. But we can soften it, right? So rather than a discontinuity between ourselves and the other living things, dramatic discontinuity, we can still be human exceptionalists, but in a way that is more continuous, less discontinuous with others. That might help. But there is a problem there. So I need to explain to you and the listeners why I think hierarchical thinking is there. There's a problem about being an animal. And that problem is that in order to live and in order to flourish, we must kill and exploit and dismember other living things. Life feeds on life. Even if you're a vegan, you eat carrots or potatoes or lettuce, that's killing, right? And certainly in our, much of our success has been dependent on the killing, the consumption, the exploitation of animals and their byproducts. But being the kind of beings that we are, we need to find reasons to justify killing and doing serious harm to some sorts of beings, but not to others. And in particular, because we're highly social creatures, we need to justify why it's impermissible to kill and eat members of our own communities and yet do violence to some other kinds of beings. Now, there are a number of indigenous cultures that developed a solution to that problem, which I call the problem of killing. They develop ideas that, for instance, the hunted animal presents itself to the hunter. That's intentional, and this is connected to various ideas of the supernatural, the spirit of the animal, then departing and being reincarnated, and so on. If the animal wants to get killed, then we're not really doing any harm, are we? We don't. That's a perfect justification. That's, I think, kind of hard to sustain, if you're a hunter. to convince yourself that the animal wants to be killed, that an animal struggling in pain with a spear in its side is engaged in a cooperative activity. But it works and has worked for some people. The idea of hierarchy does the same job. I think it's done it more effectively. That has to do partially with the social history of human beings. So the idea of hierarchy, of a cosmic hierarchy of the great chain of being, which many historians of ideas think is a uniquely European idea that developed in antiquity from the work of Plato and Aristotle and then disappeared in the early 19th century. And I think that view is entirely wrong. I think it never disappeared, and it's far more widespread than Europe and peoples of European descent. They did that because of the idea that, well, the notion of the hierarchy, or the cosmic hierarchy, or the great chain of being, is that the world is organized as a hierarchy of intrinsic value. The higher a thing is on the hierarchy, the more perfect it is, the greater our obligations are to it. Traditionally, God was placed at the pinnacle, the supremely perfect being. And then archangels and angels, and we modestly placed ourselves just below the angels, and various forms of animals, and first mammals and birds and reptiles, amphibia, fish, insects, so on, down, 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 down. So the lower a thing was imagined to be on the hierarchy, the less it mattered, the more exploitable, the more killable it was. Now that's a fiction. That's a scientific fiction. It's a fiction that it's every bit as much a fiction as the idea that animals present themselves to the hunter to be killed. I think it was one of the things that made it an attractive fiction was when human beings developed sedentary agricultural societies with social hierarchies, because then there was an opportunity where we could project our politics and justify our politics by saying it reflects the cosmic order of things, the grand hierarchy. So to maintain a human way of life, well, we have had to privilege our own kind. That's our hypersociality. So just as some sort of an intellectual exercise, recognizing that we are animals like other animals, I don't think is sufficient. It might soften it a bit, but it's not sufficient to do away with dehumanization. And even if that were the case, just dehumanize them by thinking of them as plants or disease organisms. I mean, as long as, I don't think we can talk our way out of hierarchical thinking. Yeah, and as long as there's hierarchical thinking, we're going to have the possibility for dehumanization.
Yeah, because I think one really thought-provoking example you have in your book was you can't imagine, say, the moral status of your wife is equivalent to a rock or a pet or a dandelion, a flower, right? It's just not, it's inconceivable for us to think of our friends, our parents, our families as of the same moral status, right? So we can't get rid of that. And as you say, it might be very undesirable to go about it that way. I was thinking of an example where, and it's not really going to be exactly specific to dehumanization, but I study in Australia, and there used to be, there is routinely from time to time shark attacks on human beings. And sometimes, when a shark attacks a human being and the human being dies, the community gets into uproar and they want to kill the shark. But you'd be surprised. Sometimes the victim's family will actually say, no, the shark was doing a natural thing. And, of course, we are saddened and grieving over the loss of our family member, but the shark didn't do anything wrong and we shouldn't exact revenge. And I think, in terms of what you just said, maybe we can soften the way that we conceive human beings as having a very special moral place, in the chain of being.
Yeah, so we're capable of moral reasoning, right? And even if at the gut level, we are condemned to privilege our own kind, or those who we regard as our own kind, because that's interesting as well. the boundaries between kinds of things are boundaries we draw, just like the boundaries between communities. You know, people talk about in-groups and out-groups, but the division between in-group and out-group is a political creation, right? It's not there in nature. So we can, even if we're condemned to have this sort of gut level response, we can also think about it, you know, and recognize and maintain contradictory attitudes. I mean, we talked earlier about the human mind being capable of sustaining contradictions. Well, here's an example. We might find we can't help thinking hierarchically, and yet also recognize that there's something illegitimate, intellectually illegitimate, about thinking hierarchically.
So on that note, actually, my next question dovetails with the concept of contradiction and with one of your articles where you said, well, sorry, actually the article is not written by you, but the article is from Time Magazine, Why Calling Donald Trump an Animal Doesn't Fix Anything. And you were quoted in the article, and obviously you vociferously argued that it doesn't solve the problem to call Donald Trump and his supporters, you know, the same dehumanizing labels, right? Yeah, and of course I understand and I totally agree that, you know, we shouldn't do a tit for tat, and quite obviously fighting dehumanizers by dehumanizing them isn't the right approach. And I want to share something personal. Like, obviously I have friends who support leaders like Trump. I even used to have a friend that, you know, thankfully is no longer a friend, that used to have a wallpaper of Adolf Hitler on his phone, and he was you know, anti-Semite. And so I don't want to dehumanize even the people in our lives, right? But and actually the other important point that you also mentioned is that in chapter 13 of your book on Inhumanity is, I'm going to quote you directly, "It's wrong to assume that dehumanizers can be ameliorated by simply arguing with them that superficial differences aren't important, and we simply need to convince them to recognize the humanity in others." So it sounds to me like, okay, this is really tough, right? What are we going to do about these people? And what I want to ask you is that, like, so I obviously don't want to dehumanize these people, but I also don't think I'm dehumanizing them or criticizing them from a moral standpoint, because as according to your definition, I'm not labeling them as a sub-animal or a creature, and I'm not ascribing racial characteristics to them. I just simply really, really disagree vehemently with their ideas, right? So I think what I'm trying to ask you is that, how do we you know, gain that balance of, like, okay, we're not trying to dehumanize our political opponents, let's put it that way, right? But we recognize they're a very dangerous force. So how do you work with that, you know?
Okay, so there's a difference between trying to address the problem of dehumanization per se and how we engage with people who are committed to dehumanizing or other toxic views. And really to get very far with the problem, we have to address it on the large scale, through, you know, political means, through economic means, through educational means. But of course, we are often engaging with people who have dehumanizing views, or they don't even have to be dehumanized. They could be just racist views or whatever that we disapprove of. And I think a lot depends on what kind of results you want to get, right? I don't think it's ever right to resort to dehumanization or racialization as a response to people with whom one disagrees, even profoundly disagrees morally, and whose views one profoundly disapproves of. That's not the same as expressing moral disapproval. Of course, you can express moral disapproval. But if you want to change the person's mind or have any hope of doing that, I'm skeptical of whether moral disapproval by itself will do anything at all. And it can make, I mean, it can make you feel really good because you're standing up for what's right. Here's what I try to do. I try to be interested in why the person has the views that they have. being fully aware that it's entirely conceivable that if the right forces were brought to bear on me in my development, I would have similar views. There's some kind of story there. You know, people who are white supremacists, genuine, sincere white supremacists, think that white supremacism is true. They think all the evidence is in their favor, and there's some reason why they think that, and so on. So I try, and don't take this as me saying I succeed. I try to have conversations with people. Now, this mostly happens in online environments. And I try to be genuinely curious. I try to take an interest in what their views are and why they have them. And that's perfectly compatible with disagreeing with them and expressing disagreement. Now, you might say, well, but David, didn't you write in that book, or didn't you say in the interview that just convincing people that their views are mistaken isn't going to do it? Or trying to convince them? Yeah, I did say that. But I think what works here is not so much the cognitive content, it's the sort of relationship I'm trying to establish with them, right? So if they're an anti-Semite, or if they're a Trump zealot or whatever, one thing that's going to happen, maybe, is they come away from their conversation with me being unable to think of me as some kind of,
human being,
horrible, well, being unable to think of me as subhuman or destructive or
harmless,
or whatever. That is, I may have been able to plant a seed of doubt to modify their views. And I've had some conversations that worked out very well in that respect. One of the problems is figuring out if it's worked well, because in those sorts of conversations, particularly online, the person whom one is speaking to is largely performing for their own social group, right? So even if their confidence is shaken in their views, they are likely to find it very difficult to make that clear, to make that apparent, because they don't want to be alienated from their social networks. But, we can all just do the best we can and ask ourselves what kind of an effect we're trying to produce. What's the goal? Keep your eyes on the goal, and then try and behave accordingly.
Yeah, I do think that, at least in my personal experience, as you said, the relationship component is really important. It's something that I've learned from other philosophers, like Massimo Pittigucci, who talks about how using a Stoic kind of framework or Aristotle kind of framework, you want to focus on the ethos, if I've got the Greek word correctly. But basically, you got to build the emotional connection to that person to at least get some of that content in and change minds. So I have a couple of ending questions, but before I do that, Santosh, you want to come in with something, and then after that, I have some stuff.
I think three things that came to my mind is the spiritual lens to what you just mentioned, and then there is the Marshall Rosenberg lens, and thirdly there's the Dr. Gabor Mate. So, like, first, from the spiritual lens, a lot of this is understanding the dehumanization that's going on in others stems from this view that only hurt people can hurt others. And so what you want to do is to tune into the pain and the hurts that they have faced, which they are projecting onto others. And when you empathize with the deeper pain and the hurts that they are coming from, something within them opens up. They don't see you as an adversary. They see you as an empathetic human being who's trying to connect. Yeah. And that's the huge, and that's the important part about rapport building. Something about Trump, right? Or something about, let's say, Hitler And this is a very important, very powerful spiritual process, which is to say that actually I can see myself in you. When I am able to, and part of the consciousness, the play of consciousness is that these people and these events are mirrors to the parts of our psyche that we have been resisting. This is shadow work. So a person, Trump or Adolf Hitler, who makes us feel uncomfortable is actually reflecting a part of ourselves that we ourselves have not integrated or accepted or come to make terms with or make peace with. It's a reflection. And so the work is not on that person. It's not convincing that person he or she is wrong or right. It's the inner work I need to do of making peace with the parts of myself that I've been uncomfortable with or that's stirring within me. Yeah. So that's the inner work. It's a spiritual practice of like making peace with myself. Shadow work, right? Parts of myself that I still need to integrate. So that's the spiritual lens of like everything happens for a reason, and it's a mirror of our own consciousness. The Marshall Rosenberg perspective is that of nonviolent communication. And so there's a strategy to the way we deal with such people. And it's a lot about understanding the unarticulated and unexpressed needs that they have. And once you understand that, when you meet those needs, things just click and things get resolved. Yeah. And then the third one, which is the Dr. Gabor Mate, the trauma-informed approach. Yeah. So that's understanding this collective trauma and healing the collective trauma. Yeah. So I mean, those were like some things that came to my mind. Yeah.
Okay, just a quick response. I don't agree with everything there, but I think you and I, well, if we get down to basics, we're close to the same page. I'm a big believer in compassion. Am I always capable of it? No. Sometimes people frighten me too much. Sometimes it is because of factors within myself that I'm not at peace with. Sometimes I just don't want to be compassionate to people. But I usually make an effort if I can. And I think that is important on the one-to-one level. Now, there's something else to be said here, because this can easily be misunderstood. Treating others compassionately when you are in danger of being seriously harmed or killed is not a particularly good idea. Save the compassion for when you're safe, right? So people who are victims or potential victims of those with very, very dangerous beliefs and values, the burden should not be placed on them to be, overflowing with understanding and so on.
Sorry, my mic got a bit cut off there, so I didn't hear a little bit of the beginning. But yeah, thanks, David, for saying that. Yeah, I do think it's so important to take into account the context of when it's possible to apply, an empathetic approach, and also where there are certain contexts where it's just not the right time and place. And actually, in my undergraduate studies, I did look into truth and reconciliation councils, right? I don't think we have time to get into that, but I do think that like you need a very special time and place and special platforms to be able to do things like that, to reach out and to build connections between victim and perpetrator. Yeah. Okay, so I want to ask you a very imaginative philosophical question. So so here it goes. Okay, so I want you to think about fast forwarding to the future, and this thing that the world is significantly more enlightened. Maybe think of it like the way Steven Pinker, describes it or desires it. There are more mixed marriages. You are in a mixed marriage yourself. Every child is subjected to a DNA test. And so every person knows that there are 80% this race, 10% this race, whatever, right? So they understand that the racial identity is much more nuanced and varied. And then maybe also in this new world, there's sophisticated artificial intelligence algorithms that will measure people's propensity to falsehoods and maybe even propaganda. And maybe there is a David Livingstone Smith dehumanization diagnosis and assessment tool. Right? So this is the new world. Okay, this is maybe a world in 20 years to come. My question to you is that will the world be in a much safer place from dehumanization?
Yeah, I want to tweak your world a little bit here. I wanted the idea of race to have been entirely abandoned as an illusion, and I think the world would be a safer place. Yeah. In fact, I think if we could get rid of race, we'll have made a huge step towards getting rid of dehumanization, or at least constraining it.
And is that really possible? Because actually, I didn't get a chance to ask this, but aren't there forms of dehumanization without the accompanying racial factor?
Yeah, but the racial, there very probably are. This is something I'm working on now, and it's actually really difficult because sometimes it's hard to make the distinction between dehumanization and related phenomena. But I would say, yeah, I'm inclined to say yes. Racialization doesn't have to accompany dehumanization, but de facto, racialization very, 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 very often does, and it's very often a precondition for dehumanization. So if we could get rid of race, which I think we should, because I think it's scientifically vacuous and it's basically been in the service of evil ever since it was invented, we will have cleared out one of the very basic common preconditions for dehumanization and the accompanying atrocities.
Okay, and also, so throughout our conversation, we talk a lot of philosophy, and you talk about charismatic leadership and how pivotal that is in engendering, whether it's fascist movements or even dehumanization. And so, in one of your essays, you decide to take down another public philosopher, Jordan Peterson. You sort of use him as you employ the Max Weber's concept of charismatic authority, and you describe that charismatic authority, they serve a certain function in times of rapid social change, and Jordan Peterson is one such figure. But as you put it, charismatic leadership has never been about logical consistency or even rational coherence, right? So I'm going to leave it to our viewers to go and dig up the essay. I'll probably put it in the description box or something. But what I want to ask you as a consequence of this blurb, right, is what is a good philosopher? How does someone know someone's a good philosopher?
Well, you can be a good philosopher in lots of different ways. There's not one formula. In fact, philosophy itself is a lot of different things. And philosophers who try to define philosophy often disagree with one another about that. So I would say that there are a collection of philosophical virtues which people can display in a greater or lesser degree. And you don't have to be a professional philosopher to display philosophical virtues, or even display more of them than many professional philosophers do. Certain imaginative capacities are important. The precision, intellectual courage, intellectual integrity. I mean, all of these and more, right? So there are people that I regard as really good philosophers for very, very different reasons. Now, I have to stick in here something, though. And that is, and this is not an answer to your question, but it's related, and I think it's really important. I think that a lot of philosophy, a lot of professional philosophy, is a terrible waste of intellectual capital. That, you know, we split hairs while the world is burning. And good philosophers, say philosophers who can do wonderful technical work, who are just so smart, you know, who are like way, I don't think I'm particularly intelligent. I think my saving grace is I'm somewhat creative, but I'm not particularly, but they're philosophers. So many were so smart. Gosh, if they turn those talents to addressing the really awful challenges, the really profound challenges that confront us, I think that would be a wonderful thing. I think they would be much better philosophers because they're adding a very important philosophical virtue to their armory.
David, you are a professionally acclaimed philosopher, and I was shocked to find out from a 2016 APA interview that you failed high school twice, you dropped out of community college, you don't have an undergraduate degree, I'm not too sure about that, but you have a PhD in philosophy, obviously, but you've never taken a philosophy class.
That's right.
Yeah, okay, so then explain to us that, because you are a huge inspiration to me in that regard, right? How you do it, you know, what's the secret? But along with that, let me give you my final question for tonight, right? Because we talk about pessimism, we talk about, you and I share very, very similar sentiments about the state of mankind and where we're going in this world right now. You know, you research such a dark, macabre topic, right? So what I want to ask you is, what guides your personal philosophy? So is there religion? Is there something else? Existentialism? What is it that drives you to still continue doing the work that you do?
Oh, certainly not religion. I'm irreligious. In fact, I'd say I'm an anti-theist. If God exists, God needs to be condemned for crimes against humanity, among other things. I don't have any guiding philosophy. I could say really nice things about, like, well, you know, as I often say, I want to change the world. That's somewhat true. It's also very self-flattering, isn't it, that I have these noble objectives. I don't know. I'm curious about some things. I think that some things are way more important than others, morally speaking. And I enjoy figuring things out, but I don't enjoy figuring just anything out. So I'm not the kind of, I have this taxonomy of philosophers, and it would apply more generally to thinkers, I think. There are puzzle solvers and there are artists. I'm not a puzzle solver. I don't like solving puzzles. I have no patience with that. But I do like painting pictures of the world that I think have something to be said in their favor. And that's a big driving force for me. So I think that's the best I can do. I mean, ultimately, as you pointed out, I'm influenced by Freud. I don't know what drives me. Kinds of fantasies, but I don't know what the well springs of it all are.
So how do you do it then? How do you manage to get?
How do I do what? How do I do what?
A professor in, to be a professor in philosophy, despite all the, your history, right? Not having taken classes and stuff.
Look, I got lucky. That's it. I mean, yeah, everything you said about my background was true. I don't have a bachelor's degree. I dropped out of community college. I failed high school at least 2 times, maybe 3 times. It's so long ago, I don't remember. I failed high school because I was bullied severely. And that's actually really important to why I have the interest in the things I have interest in, just by the way. And I did my PhD in philosophy without ever having studied philosophy before. I wanted a PhD for all sorts of reasons. And that seemed like the most straightforward. There was a guy at the University of London who was really interested in Freud. And that was the connection. And I ended up with this, a tenure track job as a philosophy professor. But it's not a pathway I particularly recommend to people. Like, I was extremely fortunate that things worked out. And in retrospect, I'm happy that I followed the trajectory that I did, although it was uncomfortable. And I probably would have greater career success if I had gone a more conventional route. I think it's given me a kind of independence of thought, which I value very much.
I wholeheartedly agree, and I'm so glad that your personal history has turned out the way it is, and hence you're able to contribute immensely to the world with your work. And I really thank you for that. Santosh, any last words before we close? Okay, I think.
Yeah, I think so. My biggest takeaway is the advice that you gave early on is the more we embrace our fallibility, the greater the probability of being more infallible. Yeah, I think that's very profound, very, very profound. Yeah, the more I admit that I'm human and I'm fallible, and the more we share our vulnerability, like the more we share that fallibility, I think, yeah, the less likely we are to make a dehumanizing mistake. Yeah, that was a very powerful shift for me.
Oh,
yeah,
I'm glad.
We believe too much in our self-righteousness, and when you made that shift for me, right, the cloak of self-righteousness just came off. Like, all of this, yeah, you can be human. You gave us the permission to be raw, authentic human beings who can make mistakes and who can acknowledge that we have monsters and demons within ourselves. And it's okay to have those demons. Yeah, I think that was very, very profound and powerful for me as a shift in my consciousness. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I'm glad you found that useful. And I've really enjoyed this conversation. I want to thank both of you so much.
No, it's our pleasure, as I mentioned, our pleasure and our honor. So with that said, I hope whoever is still listening up to now, I hope you've enjoyed the episode. And please look up David's work. I'll leave some website and some links in the description box. And once again, thank you for tuning in.